Okay, so time to start exam review for exam 2. Exam 2 is going to be in the exact same format that exam 1 was in, but there's a major change that I wanted to let you know about. Part 1 and part 2 are now independent of one another. In the old exam, you had multiple choice questions and short answer questions. Hi, Kaylin. Just waiting for Caitlin here for a minute. Hi, Caitlin. How are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. So I was just working on explaining the format of the exam. There's been one major change. I've decided that I'm going to split the multiple choice questions up from the short answer questions. And the reason for that is that I felt like students were feeling rushed in their writing for the short answer questions when the test was timed all together at once. So now you get 2 minutes apiece for the multiple choice questions, and there are 30 of them. So that's a 60-minute section. And then part 2, you have 8 questions. They're worth 5 points each, and you have 10 minutes per question. So that's an 80-minute block of time. You do have to start and finish each section once you sit down and open it, but they are independent of one another. So you can do part 1 on one day and part 2 on another day if you want. All right, so if we look at the eras that we've covered since the first exam, there are 13 of them. Some of them more distinct than others, and I think they'll be a little bit easier for you to tell which one is which when you get to looking at the slides with me. So first we talked about the Dutch Baroque. We talked about the Dutch Baroque in Northern Europe. We talked about the Rococo, English satire and English society painting. We have the neoclassical, Enlightenment, Romanticism, early and late, Orientalism. We have the art of the French Academy, early photography, realism, Impressionism, and post-impressionism. So we'll start with the Dutch Baroque. Remember that the Dutch Baroque art is highly affected by the Protestant Reformation. And so art in that area is made for the middle class because the church was no longer a patron of art. They couldn't be because Martin Luther felt that they were worshiping icons instead of worshiping God. And so because of that, the artists were looking for a new venue, a new place to market their art, and the middle class were just the people who wanted to buy the art. And so because of that, we end up with the birth of the modern art market. Oftentimes in the Dutch area, painters became masters of a particular subject matter. So, sorry, my throat seems to have a frog. If you think back to Jan Steen's The Feast of St. Nicholas, Jan Steen was a genre painter just like Vermeer. Vermeer has a little bit more of a niche. Jan Steen has his own niche. Vermeer's paintings were more about the light. They were about moral issues, but they were done through the lens of a domestic genre scene. So whatever that was going on at home was the subject matter of the painting. We also have a new type of painting called the vanitas. The vanitas was a still life that was customized. It was customized by collecting certain things that the commissioner owned and put into the painting so that the purchaser of the art would identify with that work of art. In the Vanitas, the point of the Vanitas is that everything in the still life has some sense of life mortality. And so we see this decaying feeling going on within the still life. It was a way to remind the patron that life was short, that there was always a beginning and an end, and so they should live a moral life. Genre paintings, I just mentioned, like Vermeer's Holding a Balance. We'll look at that. There's new sense of the use of the camera obscura. If you remember, scenes often looked flattened out due to the camera. And an example of that would have been Vermeer's view of the Delft. Morality was reminded in Dutch painting because they are Protestant, and Protestant churches are banning imagery altogether. And so that moral message becomes really important to the Dutch at this time. So this is Vermeer's Woman Holding a Balance, and you can see the light shining through the window and the heavy emphasis on texture. She's pregnant. And she's weighing, I believe, her dowry. She's weighing sort of how much she's brought into the marriage. You see that Vermeer focuses really well on texture. She's wearing a jacket that's lined with fur. And you can see in the background, there's a painting that alludes to the ascension of Jesus. And so that sense of morality, of being a good, pious person, of being someone who brought something honestly into the marriage, is the way that they are reminding the viewer of morality. Vermeer's paintings, the morality isn't quite so in your face. It's very subtle and it's imbued, sort of laced into the painting. Whereas, and at the very end, I'll take you to a Vanitas. I didn't put a Vanitas in the review, so I'll add it in there at the very end here. But the Vanitas was more in your face in terms of that morality message. Vermeer's paintings showcase his talent in light. He's very good at texture, which is something we associate with the Northern tradition to begin with. It's not crisp and clear like Van Eyck's is. Van Eyck's you could look at with a microscope and just be wowed. But it definitely uses the light to show how the texture turns in the light, how the texture feels real. The idea behind these paintings was sort of the idea of everyday life is our devotion and duty to God, that we should every day be devoted in what we do to our faith. Okay, so Baroque art in the North that isn't Dutch would have been a few artists that we look at are Rubens and Rembrandt. Rubens obviously famous for his voluptuous women, but Italian and Flemish ideas in the North at this point mesh together. And we see Marie de Medici as a patron of Baroque art in the North. So this is Rubens, Marie, of the arrival of Marie de Medici. You can see that she's coming off of the ship. He has a French soldier who is welcoming her and providing her security. You know that he's French because he wears a cape that has the fleur-de-lis on the back. He also wears this helmet that has that coxcomb broom attachment that is a reference back to the neoclassical. She's dressed in finery. She seems opulent. And then at the base of the ship, you see Neptune and the sirens welcoming her into her reign. Really, the story behind this painting is that Maria de Medici was sort of a boring woman and she was coming to France to help rule France, and they wanted to make her feel more interesting. Rubens' women at the bottom of the painting, the sirens that welcome her in. This is a trademark of Rubens. He tends to create these women who are sort of big and round. I don't want to say big. They're not like fat in any way, shape, or form, but they're voluptuous. They're very curvy. They have lots of fat in places that women seem to desire fat. As well as you get Neptune, who he himself is rising up out of the sea to welcome Maria de Medici. Remembering that in the Protestant tradition, sorry, just a second. Sorry. In the Protestant tradition, they're banning religious symbols. And so even though there's a winged figure above her that alludes to an angel, it's just basically Rubens' way of saying the whole world welcomes Marie de Medici's reign. Rubens is famous for texture, just like any other artist in the North. He has a sense of real timing because he's depicting an event in which Marie de Medici steps off of the boat. So there's that split second timing that we associate with the art of the Baroque. Everybody has some sort of action pose going on. That is also a hallmark of the Baroque. And you get a great sense of connection to the painting because Rubens places the sirens right at the front of the picture plane. They're very grabbing, and then he uses this strong diagonal to have Marie de Medici walk out of the boat, which creates drama. Remember, Dutch art, Baroque art in general, has a sense of drama to it, and Rubens is very good at it. It has this soft, gentle feel in the background as she is coming into the city. And then the sea sort of has this raging, this sense of, you can see that it had been raging. It's calmed for the arrival of Marie de Medici. So to sum up Baroque art in the North, you're looking for drama. I just described how dramatic is achieved by Rubens. Texture, we just looked at how texture is described in her dress and in the fabrics, as well as in the skin of the people who surround her. And non-religious imagery. Okay, so the Rococo. Remember, the Rococo doesn't really last for very long, about 70 years, comes and goes pretty quickly. The stylistic features for Rococo are shell-shaped. The term Rococo actually comes from the word roche-soleil, which is French for shell-shaped. And I'm horrible at French, so if you're a better French speaker than I am, please don't make fun of my poor French. I only took a semester of it. My research language was Spanish, so. Okay, back to stylistic features. In that shell shape, we get this nice curvilinear form. Pastel colors are common, and there are themes of love and hedonism. The works invite a sense of sitting and leisure activity. Artistic examples or artists who followed in the Rococo tradition were Fragonard, Watteau, Boucher, and Beaufront. Beaufront was the very first interior designer. And basic background information. The aristocracy are responding to the death of King Louis XIV. Remember, in the Baroque time, there was this great devotion to the state. King Louis XIV takes everybody and moves them to Versailles. And he says, your whole purpose in being in Versailles is to worship me because I'm the Sun King. I'm literally a god here on earth, and you shall do everything for me. Just him getting dressed was a 4-hour ordeal. It was a ceremony. It was a big deal. Okay, so art from the Rococo looks sort of like this. This is Fragonard's The Swing. And the story in itself is a hedonistic story. The woman swinging back and forth. Her chaperone is actually a reverend. He's a preacher. She's not wearing any underwear. Women don't wear underwear back in this day. And she's opening her legs as her lover hides in the bushes to give him a peep show. The little Cupid's pointing his finger to his lips, saying, shh, don't tell anybody. She kicks her shoe off in delight as she's teasing the man below her. You see this the Rocheli shell shape here in the way that the trees and foliage are placed. And you also see just tons of pastel. You get a little bit of dark navy in the shadowing, but for the most part, this is 100% done in pastel colors. It has a party feeling to it. The fête gallant is a common subject matter in Rococo art, that partying of the aristocracy. English satire and English society is different from the Rococo because it doesn't focus on the fun of the aristocracy. Instead, it focuses more on the record of wealth. It has a satirical basis because many times it's used as a society painting, like it's published in newspapers, and it speaks of the upper classes snobbery. Major artists who were part of the society painting were Hogarth, Reynolds, and Gainsborough. These paintings comment on the fabric of society and social class structure, which we'll look at one by Gainsborough, you'll be able to see. And the emphasis on the structure of arranged marriages is very much a common theme within these works of art. As you begin to examine them, you realize that women really are in a precarious position, and oftentimes infidelity is something that happens a lot in this era. Because marriages were more looked at as a business arrangement than they were a love arrangement. Okay, this is William Hogarth's Mr. Oh, I'm sorry. This is Gainsborough. I get too many words running around in my head. This is Thomas Gainsborough's Mr. and Mrs. Andrews. It was done in the early 1800s. You can see Mr. Andrews standing next to Mrs. Andrews. Her maiden name was Mrs. Frances Carter. They have married as an arranged marriage because it secures them both title and land and wealth. At this time, wealth is equal to land. So there's a large expanse of landscape, which proves their wealth within society. You see Mrs. Andrews sitting on this bench with this big, huge, voluptuous dress. Interestingly, though, while that dress looks fancy to us, it's casual wear for them because it comes in 2 pieces. I don't know if a corset's worn with it or not. And there's this blank spot that's left in the center, and we don't know why. Some have speculated that they were hoping for a child, and so they leave a blank spot so that they can add the child into the portrait. Portraits like these were very, very expensive. The only portraiture that they had were paintings, and so because of that, Sometimes they would leave blank spots so that as they had children, children could be painted within the painting. Mr. Andrews is out hunting because he has plenty of leisure time to go enjoy his land that was gifted to them by Mr. Carter, who was Francis's father. These people are upper middle class. We call them the landed gentry. They're people who got rich by being handed down land from a family member. The dog looks up at Mr. Andrews in a sign of respect. There's been much research about dogs in these type of paintings and how they actually represent social class structure and not just a dog. This is Marriage a la Mode by Hogarth and is more blatant in its satire. It was something that was published in the newspaper. Oftentimes Hogarth painted paintings like these that were published in newspapers to sort of air out the ills and sins of the upper middle class. These two have just gotten married and they've had a party. Only they didn't party together, they partied separately. She's had a big bunch of people over and that's why the room is quite so messy. He's been out whoring around for the night. We know so because the dog is picking a pair of underwear out of his pocket. There's a sword with a ribbon on the ground. Her violin sits on the ground, as well as the overturned chair. The butler has had just enough of their sort of debauchery and foolishness, so he's just shrugging his shoulders like, I don't know what to do with these kids. They were very much children. People got married at a very young age, and sort of had this life of leisure and partying. You know, like today we go to the mall, we go to the movies, we go do things like that for fun. What they did for fun was have people over and enjoy cards. Women were often taught interesting skills like singing or to play the violin or needlepoint so that they could entertain guests. They were raised to be hostesses. Well, the neoclassical comes along and says, I'm sick of you aristocracy. You're always doing things that are all about you. And it's time that we get back to having a strong France, a strong sense of European devotion to the state. And neoclassicism begins from is about 1750 to 1850. I don't know why I left my 7 out. I apologize. All right, so there was an emphasis on mythological themes. That is the part of that goes back to the classical. So it was a sense of classical revival because you were seeing lots of themes that look like people are dressed in Roman clothes and stuff like that. There's an emphasis on patriotism. The works of art are more logical and stoic. They're painted, the cities are painted in a sense of perfection. The painted surface is very flat. It tends to have a Roman feel to it and it recalls Roman architecture. One of the most famous people that we look at in this era is David. We'll talk about him a lot. Cantaletto was also one that we looked at quite a bit. In architecture, we see buildings that represent old classical buildings from the Roman Empire. Thomas Jefferson's Monticello is loosely based on the Parthenon or the Pantheon. At this time, education of young adults centered on taking trips to Europe to see the world. We talked about that in class. It was called the Grand Tour. So this particular work is by David. It's called The Oath of the Horatii. And you can see right away the neoclassical themes that come about in it. You've got this group of men who are pledging allegiance to their father. They're fighting for a cause. They're obviously fighting someone, so the opposing side is an important part of this painting. They're pledging to their father that they will go out and fight to the death. They will either defeat the enemy or not return home. The women in the background have this like swooning, grieving look on their faces as they comfort each other. And the reason is the woman in the center is engaged to the man who they are fighting, meaning that there's a opposition. She's engaged to someone who's fighting for the opposition. So she's in a precarious place because she either loses a brother, one of these guys, or her fiance, who they're getting ready to go fight. And the women are also represented as a way of honoring their devotion, stating that the men who are fighting have families, they have wives, they have children, and in those battles, lives will be lost and the women will grieve. Your textbook refers to this as classical revival. I don't always agree with that. This is neoclassical. The other thing that I would tell you about this particular painting is that it's an interesting painting because it was commissioned by the French government. And so it has that classical, neoclassical look to it. Oddly enough, became a beacon of propaganda for the French Revolution. So it was exhibited in the salon. The people loved it so much. It gained such headway. It was really popular, and it began being printed over and over as a painting to fight for the French Revolution. The commoners identified with the painting, and it was one of the things that helped overthrow the French government, or the French era, the French aristocracy. So another sort of leg of that neoclassical idea is Enlightenment painting. Enlightenment painting focuses on education. It is painting that talks about duty as in the female role, duty to the home. It rejects religious ideas. It's the opposite of the divine right to rule. They believe that people should be picked for jobs because they are skilled at them, because they have education with which to fulfill the duty of the job. It follows the genre tradition of the Dutch, and the most famous artists from the Enlightenment were Chardin, Copley, and Derby. Mostly we see painting by Chardin. I think I covered it a little bit heavier in class. Chardin creates these domestic genre scenes just like Vermeer did, just like Jan Steen. And they talk about the woman's role in the house. This is the governess. The painting is called The Governess. And she's discussing with the young boy his new duties because he's getting older. She's telling him that education is important. We have a book tucked underneath his arm. He's wearing his finer clothes, which means he's going to step out into the world and become a man. The objects on the floor are his toys from the past that he is leaving behind to get ready to enter the world and become a responsible adult. She's brushing his hat, teaching him that it's important to look nice and be clean. She has her sewing box open in case he needs some sort of repair. And she would have been responsible for educating him. Sort of like, I guess it would be sort of like homeschooling, but she would be a highly skilled tutor. She would be there, she would live there. and help raise him up as a child into a man. All right, we go from Enlightenment to the Romanticism. The Romanticism is a reaction to the Industrial Revolution. During the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution becomes full swing, and part of that logic and stoicism comes from the Industrial Revolution. All of a sudden, the middle class are able to afford things that only the aristocracy could afford prior. And the European economy is definitely based on the slave trade. While the Europeans don't actually own slaves, they are selling them in the New World, and they are making investments in them and getting a large return from them. The subject matter of Romanticism is fueled by the spirit of revolution. We get artists like Turner and Goya and West. Stylistically, we see scenes that depict the horrific. They evoke an emotional response. Artists go to extremes to feel events that they can depict, so that they can depict them in a way that reflects that feeling. They're spiritual. They have a sense of unrestrained emotion. They are 100% the opposite feeling of the Enlightenment. They have a sense of uncontrolled nature. We get medieval and exotic themes, and the sublime becomes a very important concept. Caitlin, can you, do you remember what the sublime is? Can you sort of tell me?
I think of it as like an otherworldly almost, something that can't quite be explained.
Yeah, that's a good attribute of it. It definitely has an otherworldly feel. It's something that seems to be from divine intervention. It's something bigger than ourselves. We can't exactly describe it perfectly. We can't like box it in and define it. By its very definition, it is undefinable. All right, so in Romanticism, we see paintings like these. This is Goya's The 3rd of May, maybe the 5th of May. In Goya's painting, we see lots of Romanticism. When you think of Romanticism, think of exactly the word romanticized. It's presented to you in a way that's very controlled. As the story goes, this man is being presented in front of a firing squad. The firing squad, there's a story behind it. There was a battle. The Spanish soldiers reprimanded the French soldiers before they invaded the city and killed a bunch of the French soldiers. And so now the soldiers have come back to sort of create their revenge against the Spanish Armada that interceded them. Goya, though, gets your sympathy for the man in front of this firing squad in a few ways. Do you see one way that he does that, Caitlin?
Well, I think part of it is the white shirt. You're kind of drawn to him, and the way the white shirt kind of makes him look like he's surrendering.
Yeah, so the white shirt is the only like pure white that's in the whole picture frame. That is intentional. He is made to look like Jesus hanging on the cross. The white shirt is to symbolize his purity, even though he just got done killing half of the French soldiers. The other part of this is that you don't see any of the faces of the French soldiers of the firing squad. The face is the thing that we connect with the most as in a human relationship. It's the thing that, you know, you see the person's eyes. The face is the thing that shows the most emotion. And so by not showing the faces of the French soldiers, it gives Goya the way that to control only the emotion, or to control the viewer seeing only the emotion of the man who's afraid of being shot down. There's obviously men beside them who have been shot down. The mob of people are in great despair because this man is being presented in front of the firing squad. He holds his arms out in sort of this like give up siege gesture that was to represent Christ hanging on the cross. All right. So part of Romanticism, this is sort of a subset, is called Orientalism. Orientalism deals with themes of the Middle East and sultriness. Artists that we studied were Ingres and Jerome. And it was rooted in Napoleon's invasion of Egypt. Napoleon wanted to bring back art to the Louvre. If you've ever been to the Louvre, it's a fascinating place to go. They have the largest Egyptian collection of any museum I've ever seen in the entire world. There's an entire floor of it, all of which Napoleon stole from Egypt. Photography is invented and it fuels part of this movement. It's sort of the precursor to a new movement. And this style is accepted at the French Royal Academy because, yeah, this style is accepted at the French Royal Academy in the Paris Salon, and I'll show you why. Oh well, if I had another slide, I would show you why. It sort of does this othering thing. It sort of separates France from those other people over there that do those horrible things. And so Ingres paints here this image of a white woman with a turban on her head and highly detailed texture that we associate with the East, the hookah pipe that we associate with the East, and all this beautiful luxury fabric, which is all stuff that's imported from the Eastern trade. He's basically created a harem for a white man. Only the woman that sits for the painting is not actually anatomically possible. If this woman were actually to get up and walk around, she'd never be able to support how large her rear end is. Most women's boobs don't come out of the middle of their armpit either. So it's a fantasy. And a lot of Oriental paintings, or paintings that deal with Orientalism, are fantasy in nature. All right, so then let's talk about French Academy art. French Academy art differs from neoclassical art because it's not a romanticized look at women. If you go back to my neoclassical slide, you can see that the women are grieving, the men are going to fight. And there's a lot of Roman Greek reference. When you get to the French Academy art, we see themes of mythology, just like in neoclassicism, but we see more angels, we see more nude reclining women. This is the stuff that's being sold in the French Salon, that the French Salon patron just seems to be eating up. The male gaze is definitely one of the factors in the paintings. The subject matter is really non-confrontational in terms of French society and non-confrontational in terms of the French upper class. Told you that. Cabinet is probably one of the more famous of the artists that we looked at. And at this point, the French Academy is now rejecting important painters like Manet. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. But the point of the art of the French Academy is that the aristocracy is still living in this world of loving their naked reclining women. You know, it just seems to be the style they favor. All right, so realism. Realism is a reaction to the French Academy. It is primarily headed up by Courbet and Manet. Courbet begins it, Manet takes the torch and moves on. And the painters believe in only representing what they see with their own eyes. Art tends to be more logical. We see working scenes that show explosion of or exploitation of the working class. It is highly rejected in the French salon because of that. No longer can the French say, this doesn't happen in my country. They're looking at it head on, saying, we don't want you to know that this happens in our country. They are the reason that the working class are in the position that they are in. You've got this young boy who's moving these little stones. Remember, back in that time, the industrial farming had not been sort of hadn't exploded yet. So all that industrial machinery where you could like dig up large amounts of rocks and throw them out elsewhere to create a road hadn't even been thought of. And so the way they cleared paths and roads were to hire people to pick the rocks up and move them someplace else. And these type of people worked by living off the land. They would kind of go from city to city looking for work. And oftentimes they were people who were unfortunately in positions where they really just didn't have any other choice. Like this young man here who obviously has been doing this type of work for quite some time. You can tell by his tattered clothes that are too small for him. And ultimately, really, he should be in school. The other end of the spectrum of society is the elderly within the society. We often think of being people who should be retired, sitting at home relaxing, watching somebody else do the backbreaking work. And instead, he's the one who's picking the stones, making them smaller so that they're not so heavy. He's got a soup pot and a loaf of bread so that he can eat. And so because of the span of ages, we tend to think that this encompasses the whole of the population. Now, Courbet claimed that he was sitting in his studio one day and looked out the window and these people were sitting here. It seems a little contrived to me, like the fact that he was sitting in the studio and these two people perfectly showed up at the right age, at the right time with the right information. Okay. But Courbet does continue to paint, and we do find sort of the ills of the aristocracy and the exploitation of the lower working classes becoming more and more relevant. This style was a reaction to Marx and Engels' book released on capitalism, the Communist Manifesto. Invention of the camera comes along and it changes art altogether. We see that in Manet's work. We talked a lot about Manet's work appearing flat and relying on the outline. And we're seeing lots of workers revolting in Europe. They're revolting against the big gap between the upper class and the lower class. Okay, Impressionism. We are almost done. Remember, the Impressionists have a very distinct feel to their paintings. If I stick an Impressionist painting in front of you versus a neoclassical, it is not hard to tell the difference. Impressionists were people who painted city scenes and scenes in the countryside. Particularly Renoir painted scenes of the upper class and urban life. You get a sense of broken brush strokes that are painterly. They have the impasto quality and they're very expressive. They study the way that light hits the building at different times of day and different types of weather. We call the Impressionists the ultimate realists because what they are interested in is representing what the light looks like and what the object looks like in reaction to each other. Colors only used, they only want to paint what they see with their actual eye. They don't use black because they know that all color absorbs other colors. So when a color is dark, it means that it's absorbed lots of color. When a color is light, it means that it has absorbed less color. Now, different color theories will tell you different things, but that's what the Impressionists thought. The most famous of the Impressionists were European. There was only one American. They were Degas, Monet, Renoir, Cassatt. Degas sometimes is put in the post-impressionist class. I wouldn't ask you to identify which class he went to. They had 5 rules that they followed. You should know what those 5 rules are. Do you want to talk about those 5 rules, Caitlin, with me since we're here?
Sure. I know one of them is they painted in plein air.
Yes.
One of them.
Go ahead.
And then the black was another one.
Okay, so they painted in plein air. They painted with black, or they banned black. They had this rule that you were never supposed to show your work at the salon. They really just were very, very against showing your work at the salon. They painted alla prima, which means that the canvas wasn't already prepped. And there was one more. Why can't I come up with it off the top of my head? It'll come back to me. Sorry, there's only so much room for factual information in my head, and when I want it to come up, it doesn't always. There's another one. It'll come to me, I promise. I'll go back to it in just a minute. All right, so when we're looking at Impressionist work, you can easily see that Renoir breaks a few of those rules. He often exhibited in the Paris Salon, probably because he painted the Fête Galante. He's the most like the Rococo painters of all of the Impressionists. They really, they were sort of a loose band of people. They met in cafes and discussed stuff. They discussed art. They discussed their ideas and philosophies on the world. And they used that heavy broken brush stroke. You can see that their paintings are definitely about the light. The light focuses on the table and this woman here, who she's discussing something with here. I believe this is a self-portrait of Van Gogh. Most of them, he is in a lot of them. Or I'm sorry, not Van Gogh, Renoir. He puts his own self-portrait of him studying them in the painting. You can see the iconography of the aristocracy or the upper class with the fancy hats and the fine clothing, the finer dining with wine and cheese and fruit, just a lot of excess. And then of course we see the beautiful backgrounds with the light hitting the trees and the plants. He was in a different financial situation than the other Impressionists. Manet was very poor. You know, their work, fascinatingly enough, is very, if they lived today, would be millionaires. But back then, their work didn't sell. They were all dead and gone before anybody even took a notice of Impressionism. But they were definitely the start of modern art in terms of new styles and new ways to represent paint, new ways to represent subject matter. So post-impressionism. Post-impressionism sort of takes on a bit of a different viewpoint when it comes to color. No longer are they trying to record the light. Now they're trying to use color to represent emotion. Nighttime studies are being done more and more, and we see this fast, open brush stroke that's not gone over again and over again and over again like the Impressionists do, but you get more of a quick application of paint. It feels like it has a lot of movement. That movement seems to evoke a sense of motion, emotion, and motion. Artists associated with Post-Impressionism were Van Gogh, Seurat, Gauguin, Cezanne, and sometimes Degas. Seurat develops pointillism, and we have this new craze called Japonisme, in which there was this love for everything that was Japanese. This is a Van Gogh. You can see that the paint, while it does have a representational feel, is also trying to communicate Van Gogh's depression. This is the room that Van Gogh rented before he committed suicide. And he painted in the room a lot. He painted the room a lot. Here is the window. And you're supposed to get a sense of melancholy feeling from it. And part of that has to do with the jarring juxtaposition of the colors. The green and the orange are opposites on the color wheel. And so it feels unsettling, as if something is awry. The brush stroke is laid down very quickly. And you can see that he uses purple to counteract the green so that it jumps off the canvas and sort of is jarring in color. The paintings, the lines within the work of art have a sense of motion to them. They feel sort of cattywampus. And each of the post-impressionists sort of have their own hallmark, their own trade, their own emphasis, but they all fit into the same category of using color to communicate emotion. So let's go back. It's really bothering me that my 5 rules of Impressionism isn't coming to my head. So let me grab my other computer. Give me 1 second. And I'll finish telling you that one last rule that I can't remember. Jillian, are you CCAD or Kent?
Kent.
I thought so. Well, my thing's all screwed up and I'm having a hard time finding impressionism in the lecture. I don't know why. Okay. 6, week 7, 8, social commentary. Maybe it's after that. Oh, that's probably why. 10, realism. Yeah, I got my snapshots and put. So did you print out your review sheet? That
I have it. The mic's going a little off. I don't know what exactly.
Okay, I found my rules. They always paint in plein air. They banish the color black. They depict modern subject matter that interests the realist. That was the one I forgot. Okay. They always
right.
modern subject matter. Yeah. Okay. Just double check. A sunrise. So are there things on the okay. I just want to make sure I told you right. I'd feel really bad if I gave you wrong information. Just double checking myself. Usually when I lecture, like all my notes are right there in front of me, so I don't have to remember it all at once. But I figured for the test review, I'd know every bit of exactly what I was looking at, but I forgot that one thing. So did you have time to print out the page that had all the terms and stuff on it?
So I do all my stuff digitally. So I have a tablet that I go through and I do it all. I write it all down. So
okay. Is there anything in there that you're like, I don't know what I need to know about this thing?
Could you go over the little Dutch masters?
Yeah. Okay, so if we go back to, oh, and I promised you a Vanitas, so we'll do that too. So the Dutch Baroque, we'll go back to here with Vermeer. So in the sort of synopsis slide, I tell you that they were popular for the Vanitas, they were popular for the genre painting. So if you look at, I just love working at home because my dogs are so entertaining. I apologize for their obnoxiousness.
It's okay.
The weather's been nicer and all the windows are open, and so they just think that they need to bark at everything. I'm gonna shut the door. Give me 1 second.
Okay.
Hey! Oh, hi. Hold on 1 second. Sorry, they're working because my sister walked in the door. Okay, here's the Vanitas. The Vanitas is that work of art that is that still life. So when we talk about the Dutch masters, they master at one type of painting versus another. So in this case, the Vanitas was a mastery. And you can see like the elements of decay. You've got this orange that's half peeled that eventually will go bad. But also the pieces that are in this still life are things that are representative of the person who owns the Vanitas. So like the goblet, maybe they picked the goblet up in Venice. The oyster, not everybody can afford oysters. It's open, so that means eventually it will rot. Even here, you've got this like skull that is going to remind the viewer of their own immortality. The incense that's getting ready to burn out. So the Vanitas is one of those Dutch masteries. Jan Steen is a master at these comical scenes that are about domestic genre life for the Dutch Baroque. Let's see, this one I would say is probably the most common one. You know, they're having this gluttonous party and they're just doing, there's a pig in the house eating stuff on the floor, things like that. So Jan Steen does these domestic genre scenes that are full of mischief. Whereas Vermeer specializes in these scenes about the light. So the masters are just simply saying that each artist seems to focus on one type of art and is really good at that particular type. Make sense? Okay. What else?
Hold on. Going through. What should I know about Sigmund Freud?
Just that he was the launching point for the symbolists.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, he wrote, you know, Sigmund Freud and his his ego and id and all that. He's the like beginning point of the symbolists, which moves on then to the symbolist is the precursor to surrealism.
Okay. There was one more. Oh, okay. The Spanish Inquisition.
Okay, the Spanish Inquisition is very much like the French Revolution. The Spanish Inquisition was the Spaniards' control, sort of the backlash of the revolution. So the Spanish Inquisition were the aristocracy's response to the revolution. Goya painted for the aristocracy, and so his paintings often reflected the position of the aristocracy, but he did try to paint against the aristocracy and got in big trouble for it. So he's sort of like the David of Spain. The Spanish Inquisition was one in which if you were not Catholic, if you said you were Protestant, they considered it treason. They would take you and torture you until you converted, or they would kill you, one of the two. Just depended on how powerful you were. They did not want you practicing Protestantism. It was a threat to their divine right to rule.
Okay.
All right, Caitlin, I gotta go because my dog's barking and I have the end to my office hours right now. But if you need something else, please feel free to call me. You have my phone number. And I'm also running review again this evening at 4:30.
Okay.
Okay,
Thank you.
you're welcome. Happy testing.
You too. Not
Bye-bye.
you too. Not